He brought her to the memorial. Maren Sorenson watched her husband come up the center aisle of the little stone church in Lunenburg, with another woman's hand tucked into the crook of his elbow. And the first thing she felt was not what anyone would have guessed. It was not grief sharpening into rage. It was something closer to recognition. The quiet click of a thing arriving, exactly where you'd predicted it would, on the day you'd predicted it would arrive. She had set out 200 chairs that morning. She had arranged the white lisianthus and the cattails her grandmother had loved, the ones that grew wild along the cove. And now her husband, Caleb Thorne, was walking into the funeral of the woman who had raised her, with Sloane Pruitt on his arm, and an expression on his face that he believed read as solemn, but that Maren, who had spent 9 years learning his face the way you learn a draughty house, knew was something else entirely. It was anticipation. He thought he was watching the beginning of the part where he won. He did not know that the will had already been signed 11 weeks ago. He did not know that the holding company had already moved. He did not know that the woman in the plain black dress at the front of the church, the one he'd been calling dull for the better part of a decade, controlled more money than he could count if you gave him a calculator and a long weekend. He thought this was her lowest moment. He thought he was here to watch her come apart so he could pick up the pieces that were worth anything. He had the whole thing backwards, and nobody in that church was going to tell him. To understand why Maren simply nodded at him from across the nave and turned back to the casket without a flicker, you have to understand who she actually was, which is the one thing almost no one in her life had ever bothered to find out. She was 38. She worked 4 days a week at a housing rights clinic on Gottingen Street in Halifax, the kind of place with mismatched office chairs and a kettle that took 10 minutes to boil, and a waiting room full of people the rest of the city had decided not to see. She drove a 14-year-old Subaru with a coat hanger holding part of the exhaust. She and Caleb rented out the basement of their narrow house in Dartmouth to help with the mortgage, or so Caleb believed. She bought her clothes at the consignment shop near the ferry terminal. She packed her lunch in a yogurt container and ate it at her desk. When people met her at parties, they registered her as pleasant and forgettable, the wife of that realtor, the one who didn't say much. What none of them knew, what her own husband had never once suspected across 9 years of marriage, was that Maren Sorenson was the sole heir to the Sorenson estate, and the Sorenson estate was worth somewhere north of $270 million. Her grandmother had built it. Solveig Sorenson came to Nova Scotia in 1958 with a steamer trunk and a dead husband's life insurance check, and she spent the next 60 years turning it into a quiet empire of shipping interests, coastal land, and a property portfolio that ran from the Halifax waterfront down the whole South Shore. She did it the way she did everything without announcing it. There was no Sorenson name on any building. The holdings sat inside a lattice of numbered companies and a family trust so layered that you could have read every business page in the country for a decade and never once tripped over Solveig's name. She believed money was a tool, and that the moment you let people see the tool, they stopped seeing you and started doing arithmetic. She'd said it to Maren 100 times, in 100 forms, sitting at the kitchen table at the cottage in Mahone Bay with a mug of tea going cold in her hands. People will treat you like a sum, my girl. Don't let them know the figure, and they'll have to treat you like a person. Maren's parents had drowned off Cape Sable when she was 7, the both of them, a squall that came up faster than the forecast. After that, there was only Gran. Gran taught her to read tide tables, and people with the same patient attention. She'd point out, on the drive home from a dinner with one of her business associates, how the man had changed the angle of his shoulders the second he learned who was paying. She taught Maren to watch the moment a person's face shifted from looking at you to looking through you toward what you could do for them. By the time Maren was 16, she could catch that shift the way a birder catches a wing in the corner of the eye. By the time she was 23, she was so tired of catching it that she went to Gran and asked, in effect, to disappear. Gran understood. She had wanted the same thing once and never got it, so she helped. Maren kept the surname Sorenson because it was common enough on the South Shore to mean nothing, and she moved to the city, took the job at the clinic for $46,000 a year, and built a life that ran entirely on what that salary could carry. No trust money touched it. No cards connected to the holdings. The only thing she kept from the other life was a small pendant of green sea glass that Gran had found on the beach below the cottage. The summer Maren turned 10, drilled and strung on a leather cord. It was worth nothing. It was worth everything. She wore it under her collar where no one ever saw it. "You'll know the right one," Gran told her. "Because he'll never need you to be louder than you are. The wrong one will always be a little embarrassed by your quiet." Maren carried that into the bar on Argyle Street, where she met Caleb Thorne on a wet Thursday in October. She carried it through the 9 years that followed, and she would carry it out the far side, though it took her longer than Gran would have liked to admit which kind of man she'd married. Caleb sold houses. He was good-looking in a way that took effort. The gym 4 mornings a week, the teeth, the suits a notch nicer than his commissions justified. He talked about the market with a confidence that outran his understanding of it. He name-dropped clients he'd met once. He had decided early that success was mostly a matter of appearing successful, that if you stood in the right rooms in the right jacket, the substance would arrive on its own schedule. He looked at Maren and ran the calculation men like Caleb run. She was easy on the eyes and easier on the ego. She didn't compete with him for the center of a room. She'd manage things and not make him feel managed. She was, in his accounting, an excellent backdrop. They dated a year. Maren watched him the way she watched everyone, across contexts, the way he spoke to the kid bussing tables, the way he behaved when the ferry was canceled, the way he talked about women who weren't in the room. The results weren't damning. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't, back then, dishonest. He was shallow in a way that Maren, worn thin from years of catching deeper deceptions, mistook for being uncomplicated. She'd spent so long bracing for sharks that she let a remora attach itself and called it peace. They married in the 2nd year. Maren planned all of it. Caleb supplied enthusiasm and a guest list of people he wanted to impress, and then the marriage settled into the shape it would hold. Maren ran everything: the mortgage, paid out of her clinic check, and a small personal account she'd built herself. A rounding error against her real holdings, but enough to keep up appearances. The bills, the insurance, the property taxes, the snow removal, the dentist appointments, the Christmas card signed from both of them, the birthday present for his mother, chosen and wrapped by Maren, and presented as if Caleb had thought of it. Caleb ran nothing. He came home to a clean house and a hot supper and a wife who asked how his day had gone and listened to the whole answer, and never once noticed he didn't ask back. He lived inside the result of her work the way a guest lives in a hotel, enjoying the made bed without ever wondering who'd made it. His mother, Diane Thorne, made her contempt a little more legible. She'd look at Maren's consignment coat and the old Subaru and the clinic job and say things like, "It's so good of you to keep busy, dear," in a voice that meant something else. At family dinners, she'd seat Maren near the kitchen. Maren let her. It was useful, being underestimated. It was the cheapest disguise she owned. Gran saw it all from the cottage, where she still drove herself, where she still wore a steel watch that had stopped keeping time in 2009, and a cardigan with a hole in the elbow. She visited every few weeks, sat in Maren's narrow Dartmouth kitchen, drank tea from a chipped mug, and read the marriage the way she read a balance sheet. She didn't like Caleb. She never said so outright. But Maren knew her grandmother's silences the way a fisherman knows weather, by what the sky withholds. 3 years in, Gran set down her mug and said, without looking up, "A man who never once asks where the money comes from is either the most trusting soul alive, or he's decided the money will always be there for him to spend. The first kind is rare as hen's teeth. The second kind is dangerous." Maren didn't answer. "He's never asked you a single question about how this whole life of yours runs," Gran went on. "Not the bills, not the bookings, not the basement tenant you don't actually have. That tells me he's stopped seeing the woman who runs it. And when a man stops seeing her, my girl, he starts looking somewhere else." Maren filed it. She kept managing. She kept watching. 18 months later, the second half of her grandmother's sentence came true. She found it on a Monday morning, the way you find most of the things that change your life, while doing something unremarkable. She was reconciling the credit card statement at the kitchen table before work, coffee going cold, and there was a charge she didn't recognize. A restaurant on the Halifax waterfront. The expensive one with the harbor view. Dinner for $210. On a Wednesday, Caleb had told her he was at a brokerage thing in Bedford. She held the statement for a moment. She set it down. She finished her coffee and went to work. She didn't confront him. She did what Gran's granddaughter would do. She started keeping a file. Over the next 2 months, she assembled it with the patience of a woman who'd been raised on due diligence the way other kids were raised on hockey. Charges at restaurants, and a hotel in Bedford she'd never heard him mention. A gap in his calendar that didn't match the story he'd told her. a phone left charging on the nightstand one night while he showered, which she picked up, not proud of it, and which showed her a thread of messages with a contact saved as listing 114 Cabot that had nothing to do with any listing. The woman was Sloane Pruitt, 31, an agent at a competing brokerage, the kind of confident that comes from learning young that being looked at is a form of currency. The affair was about 4 months old when Maren found it. By the time her file was complete, it was 6 months old, and Caleb had started leaving for early showings on Sunday mornings. She did not cry in the kitchen. She cried once, in the Subaru, in the clinic parking lot, with her forehead on the wheel and the heater rattling. And what she felt was not heartbreak so much as a structural thing. The sensation of a load-bearing wall being quietly removed from a house that had been leaning on it for 9 years. The house didn't fall. It just started, very slowly, to tip toward the ground. That evening she called Gran. "I know," Solveig said, before Maren got the second sentence out. "How long have you known?" 2 months. My fellow who looks after the accounts flagged the man, drawing on a line of credit I'd never authorized him near. Maren closed her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to find it in your own hands. If I'd handed it to you, you'd have spent a year doubting it. Now you know what you know. What do I do?" Gran was quiet for a stretch. When she spoke again, her voice had the flat, deep-keeled weight of a woman who'd spent 60 years keeping things away from people who hadn't earned them. "You do nothing. You change nothing. You make his supper, and you ask about his day, and you let him believe the water's calm, and I'll spend whatever time I've got left building you a boat he can't sink. He'll show you the whole of himself eventually. Men like Caleb always sail farther out than they should. They always think they're cleverer than the chart. Let him run. When he runs far enough, the line will come tight on its own." So that's what Maren did. She went inside, she made supper, she set the table. She greeted Caleb when he came home, smelling faintly of someone else's perfume, and she asked about his day and listened to the answer. And she said nothing about the receipt folded in her coat pocket, or the file on the encrypted drive, or the phone call that had just set a quiet machine running underneath her marriage. Gran spent the next year building the fortress. Maren learned the details only afterward, but they were thorough the way Gran was thorough. The trust was restructured so that every thread connecting the family's wealth to Maren's married life was either cut clean or reinforced past breaking. The Dartmouth house, which Caleb believed they jointly owned, was quietly moved under a numbered company inside the trust. He had never been on the title, had never read the closing documents Maren handled, had signed where she pointed and gone back to his phone. Gran brought in a lawyer named Vera Kowalczyk, a small, exact woman of about 60 who'd spent her career winning the kind of estate fights other lawyers settled, and instructed her to do something more, to watch Caleb. Not to act, just to watch and write it down. And what Vera watched, over that year, was a man emboldened by his wife's apparent blindness, sailing happily off the edge of the chart. He moved $11,000 out of their joint savings into a personal trading account he thought Maren didn't know about. He took Maren's name off a small life insurance policy and put it back on with himself as the only beneficiary. He sat down twice with a divorce lawyer in Bedford to ask in the abstract how marital property got divided in Nova Scotia, and whether an inheritance counted. He was planning. He thought he was 3 moves ahead. He had no idea the board belonged to someone else, and that every move he made was being noted in a Navy folder that grew thicker each week. Then Gran's heart, which had been failing quietly for 2 years, began to fail loudly. Congestive heart failure, the cardiologist said, the kind they manage until they can't. She had a few months. She used every day of them. She finalized the trust. She met with Maren 3 times, long afternoons at the cottage, the wood stove going, the bay gray out the window. And each meeting passed down knowledge and authority, and the strategic positioning that would come alive the moment she was gone. She walked Maren through every holding. She introduced her properly to Vera Kowalczyk as the woman who would run the estate's legal affairs going forward. She read the file on Caleb one last time and wrote across the top of it, in the careful slanted hand Maren had seen on birthday cards her whole life. "He'll come for it at the funeral. Let him. The door's already locked." Solveig Sorenson died on a Thursday morning in the upstairs bedroom at the cottage, with the window open to the sound of the water, the way she'd wanted. Maren was holding her hand. She felt the moment her grandmother left the way. You feel a boat slip its mooring, a small giving way, and then a great stillness. She sat there a while, Then she stood, straightened the quilt, and went down to the kitchen where waiting with a thermos of tea and a face composed into nothing but readiness. "It's done," Maren said. "I know. It's all in place. He can't reach any of it. He doesn't know that yet." "No," Vera said. "He doesn't." Maren looked out at the bay. She put her hand over the sea glass at her throat. "Let him come to the service," she said. "Let him bring her. Let him think it's his moment." Vera had practiced estate law for 30 years. She had seen grief wear a lot of faces. She had never seen it wear the face of a woman this calm, this level, this much like the surface of a harbor at slack tide with the whole weight of the sea underneath. "And then?" she asked. "And then," Maren said, "we let him find out who he married." The memorial was held the following Friday at the old stone church in Lunenburg. Gray morning. The cold that gets into the pews and stays. 200 came. The substantial, discreet people who'd known Solveig as a woman of few words and long memory. Maren stood near the front in a plain black dress and the sea glass pendant, receiving condolences with the steadiness of someone who'd been trained since she was 7 to carry a thing, without showing the shape of it. Her face was pale and dry. Her back was straight under a weight nobody else could see. Caleb came in 40 minutes late, which was its own kind of statement, and he came in with Sloane Pruitt on his arm. Sloane wore a charcoal dress and an expression of polite ownership, the look of a woman who has been told she's about to come into something. They walked up the aisle together, past the casket of the woman whose fortune Caleb believed he was about to take a slice of, and the room noticed. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. That particular hush moved through the mourners, the one that's half shock and half appetite for what comes next. Maren watched them come. She felt the prediction land, exact and mechanical, and again what rose in her wasn't fury. It was the calm of a sailor watching the tide do precisely what the table said it would do at 11:14 in the morning. Caleb stopped 3 feet from her. He didn't let go of Sloane's hand. He'd composed his face into sympathy, but underneath it sat the thing Maren had learned to read off him years ago. That low hum of satisfaction, the look of a man who thinks he's watching his wife's power drain out through the floor. "I'm sorry about Solveig," he said. He even managed to make it sound like he'd liked her. Maren looked at him. She looked at Sloane. She looked at their joined hands. She looked back at Caleb. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, the voice of a woman ticking a box on a list. Then she turned to the next person, waiting to offer condolences, and she did not look at her husband again for the rest of the service. Caleb read it as defeat. He read the calm as numbness, and the silence as surrender, and the whole of it as proof that Maren was exactly the small, manageable woman he'd always taken her for. Later, when he gave a short speech at the reception in the church hall, hand on Sloane's shoulder, calling Solveig a force of nature, and himself, by clear implication, the family's steady hand going forward, Maren stood at the back with her friend Noor from the clinic and let him talk. Noor's jaw was tight enough to crack a walnut. Maren put a hand on her arm. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Soon," she was right. It was 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Caleb accelerated, the way Grant had said he would. He moved out of the Dartmouth house into Sloane's apartment without a word to Maren, simply stopped coming home. And when she texted to ask where he was, he sent back one line. "I think we both know this is done." He instructed his Bedford lawyer to file. He wanted the house. He wanted half of whatever the old woman had left. And he did the thing the Navy folder had been waiting for. He drew $31,000 off the home line of credit and a joint investment account and parked it in his personal trading account, on the theory that it was marital money, and therefore half his. He did it without telling Maren. He did it because he had no idea the account was watched, that the transfer registered the same hour he made it, and that moving jointly held assets after you've already retained divorce. Counsel has an in-law that his own lawyer would later say to him, in a voice scrubbed of all professionalism. Catastrophically, breathtakingly stupid. Maren watched it all from the kitchen of the house Caleb thought they owned, drinking her coffee, reading Vera's encrypted updates each morning, the way other people read the weather. She didn't call him. She didn't plead or argue or beg him to explain. The silence was total, and it was deliberate, and it was the loudest thing Caleb had ever failed to hear. Vera phoned on a Tuesday. "He moved money," she said. "How much?" $31,000. Off the line of credit and the joint account. After he retained counsel. No notice, no consent. Maren closed her eyes and touched the pendant. "That's what Gran said he'd do." Your grandmother was rarely wrong about a man. With the altered beneficiary and the consultations on record, we have a clear pattern of dissipation. In this province, with this conduct, He is not going to be negotiating from anywhere near where he thinks he is. Schedule it, Maren said. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the service, in a glass tower on the Halifax waterfront. The boardroom had a wall of windows looking out over the harbor, mahogany table, leather chairs, the particular hush of a room where large sums change hands. Caleb arrived first in his best Navy suit, wearing the tie Maren had bought him for their 5th anniversary, which he'd chosen without quite knowing why. His lawyer, a man named Garrick who specialized in high asset splits, had assured him the morning would be tidy. Garrick had not yet seen the folder in Vera Kowalczyk's bag. He had not yet learned that his client's wife was not a $46,000 clinic worker. He was about to have a very long morning. Maren came in at 9:15. Black blazer, white blouse, the sea glass pendant, no other jewelry. Hair pulled back. She looked the way she'd always looked to Caleb, quiet, contained, easy to move past. Vera followed her, set her bag on the table, and did not smile. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Maren," he said, in a voice pitched for the room. "You're looking well." She didn't answer. She sat. She folded her hands on the mahogany and waited. Garrick opened with practiced efficiency. Marriage broken down irretrievably. His client sought an equitable division. The matrimonial home, the joint accounts, and any inheritance Mrs. Thorne had received during the marriage from the estate of the late Solveig Sorenson. He landed on that last phrase like it was the keystone of the whole arch. Vera let him finish. Then she opened her bag, took out a single folder, and laid it on the table. "Thank you, Mr. Garrick. Before we discuss division, I'll need to correct the record on a few factual matters regarding what is actually in this marriage to divide." She opened the folder. The home on Pinehaven Crescent in Dartmouth. Mr. Thorne believes it's jointly owned. It is not. It's titled to a numbered company held within the Sorenson family trust, established before the marriage. Mr. Thorne's name appears on no deed, no mortgage, no document associated with the property. In legal terms, he has been, for 9 years, a guest. The room went quiet. It took about 3 seconds for the sentence to reach the part of Caleb's brain that handled danger. The joint investment account, Mr. Thorne moved $31,000 out of it, and the home line of credit into his personal trading account on the 22nd of October, without his spouse's knowledge or consent, and after he had already retained Mr. Garrick. That establishes intent. It is dissipation of marital assets, and it is documented down to the timestamp. Garrick's pen stopped. The life insurance policy, originally naming both spouses, was altered by Mr. Thorne in September to name himself as sole beneficiary undisclosed. We have the original and the amendment. Vera turned a page. Now, the estate of Solveig Sorenson. She looked directly at Caleb, and there was nothing warm in it. Mr. Thorne appears to believe his wife came into a modest inheritance subject to division. I need to correct that. She set a second sheet on the table. The Sorenson estate, held in trust since well before this marriage, and never once commingled with marital funds, is valued at approximately $274 million. It comprises coastal real estate across 3 provinces, shipping and port interests, and controlling stakes in 2 private operating companies. Mrs. Thorne is the sole beneficiary. Under the law of this province, trust property of this kind, kept separate, is not subject to division. The silence after that had a texture to it. Garrick stared at the page. His face ran through several recalculations and arrived nowhere good. Caleb stared at his wife. His mouth was open. The certainty that had carried him into the room, the bone-deep assumption that he held the leverage, and that his quiet wife would sign where he pointed the way she always had, drained out of his face like color, out of a photograph left too long in a window. 200 and... He started. He stopped. He swallowed. 270. Maren looked at him. She didn't speak. Her silence, the thing he'd spent 9 years filing under passive, was revealing itself as what it had always been. Not the silence of a woman with nothing to say, but of a woman who had never needed an audience for her power. Vera went on, even and dry. Given the pattern of misconduct, the unauthorized transfer, the altered beneficiary, the undisclosed consultations, we'll be filing a counterclaim for the full recovery of the dissipated funds plus costs. Mr. Thorne's exposure, conservatively, runs past $160,000. Garrick set down his pen and turned his client with the specific exhaustion of a lawyer who's just realized he was lied to about everything that mattered. "Caleb," he said, "we need a moment." Caleb didn't move. He was still looking at Maren, searching her face for the woman he thought he'd married, the small one, the manageable one, the one who never fought. He didn't find her. "You knew," he said. His voice had gone to gravel the whole time. "You knew." Maren looked at him for a long moment. When she answered, it was in the same voice she'd used across 9 years of suppers and folded laundry. Calm, unhurried. "I knew about Sloan," she said. "I knew about the money and the lawyer and the insurance. I knew about every dinner on the waterfront and every Sunday morning showing that wasn't a showing. I knew while I made your breakfast and paid your bills and ran the whole of the life you walked around inside." She paused. So did my grandmother. She knew before I did, and she spent the last year of her life making certain that the day you finally showed me who you were, you wouldn't be able to carry off so much as a coffee mug that was mine. Caleb's hands were flat on the table, the fingers gone white. "You brought her to Gran's funeral," Maren said. "You held her hand in front of the casket. You stood up in that hall and called yourself the steady one. You looked at me, and you thought you were watching me break." She stood. She picked up her bag. "You were watching me finish," she said. She walked to the door. Vera gathered the documents and followed. At the threshold, Maren paused without turning. "The locks on Pinehaven change Friday," she said to the room behind her. "Your things will be boxed and sent wherever you tell Vera's office to send them. The joint accounts are frozen pending the dissipation claim. Goodbye, Caleb." The door closed. The harbor went on, glittering past the windows, gray and enormous and entirely uninterested. After that, Caleb Thorne's life came apart the way a hull does once the water finds the seam, slowly and then all at once. The house notice came first. His belongings arrived at Sloane's apartment in 11 boxes, the moving fee billed to him. Then his brokerage ran the routine review that a divorce filing triggers, found the dissipation claim in his disclosures, and put him on leave. His name, which had been his whole stock in trade, started to mean something he couldn't sell. The accounts froze. His cards began declining at the restaurants where the host used to know him. And then Sloane Pruitt did the arithmetic. She was 31, and she had options. And the man on her couch at 2 in the afternoon, watching the markets with the hollow look of someone whose bluff had been called all the way down, was not the man she'd been sold. She told him on a Thursday, no drama, just that she thought they wanted different things, and he should probably find somewhere to be by the weekend. He sat in his car in her parking lot for a long time. He had no house, no job, no wife, no money he could reach, no name left to trade on. Every surface his life had rested on had been a thing Maren built and held, and now that she'd simply stopped holding it, there was nothing underneath. There never had been. His mother, Diane, who had seated Maren by the kitchen for 9 years, did not return his calls for a month. Maren, meanwhile, stopped hiding. She joined the board of the small foundation Gran had run for decades and widened its work from literacy into housing. The thing Maren had spent her whole quiet career inside, putting up the money herself. A real number this time, the kind that builds buildings. She kept the clinic on Gottingen Street open and tripled its staff. She hired the women she'd worked beside for years and paid them what the work was actually worth. She did it all with the same patient, unhurried method she'd once used to run a household. Except the household was now 4 counties wide. The Chronicle Herald ran a profile in the spring. The Sorenson heir, nobody knew. An account of her years of disappearing into an ordinary life. The clinic, the consignment coat, the choice to live without the weight of the name. It didn't mention Caleb. It didn't have to. Everyone who'd known them both understood the white space around the words. The foundation's first big event was held that June, in a hall on the Halifax waterfront with the harbor out the windows. Maren stood at the podium in a plain dark dress and the sea glass pendant and spoke for 10 minutes about invisible work and the women who do it, the ones who hold up whole lives and whole families and never get their names on the deed. She didn't raise her voice once. The room was silent the whole way through. Caleb saw the photograph of her from that night on the side of a bus shelter on Barrington Street, weeks later, part of the foundation's campaign. He was walking to an interview at a brokerage half the size of the one he'd lost, in a suit that needed pressing, carrying a resume he'd rewritten 4 times. He looked up, and there was his ex-wife, larger than life, looking out over the city with an expression he had never once seen across 9 years of marriage, certainty. The look of a woman who has stopped making herself small for people who couldn't see her at full height. He stood on the sidewalk a long time. Then the light changed, and he crossed the street and the picture went out of view behind him. And he walked on to a job that would pay less than half of what he'd had, and took it, because every choice he had left had been made for him by a woman he'd never bothered to know was making them. Late that summer, on a Sunday morning, Maren sat on the porch of the cottage at Mahone Bay with a mug of tea, and the bay laid out flat and silver in front of her. Her phone sat on the rail. On it was the encrypted folder she'd kept for 2 years, every receipt and timestamp and screenshot, the whole record of how a marriage had ended. She opened it. She scrolled through it once, slowly, the way you walk back through a house you've already moved out of, not because you've forgotten anything, but to be sure there's nothing left worth carrying. Then she selected the folder and deleted it. The phone asked if she was sure. She said yes. The screen cleared. She didn't do it because she forgave him. Forgiveness wasn't the right tool for the job. It didn't fit the bolt. She did it because the file had done its work. It had armed her. It had protected her. It had let her walk into that glass room and end the thing on her own terms. And now keeping it would only mean keeping him. And she was finished carrying people who hadn't earned the weight. She set the phone down. She put her hand around the bit of sea glass at her throat, worn smooth by 60 years of salt water and 10 of her own fingers. And she thought about Gran at the kitchen table, the cold tea, the steel watch that didn't tell time. "You'll know the right one," Gran had said, "because he'll never be embarrassed by your quiet." She hadn't found him yet. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But she'd found the thing Gran never quite promised out loud, the thing she'd probably hoped Maren would have to find on her own. That quiet was never the same as empty. That a woman who runs everything without thanks isn't weak for doing it. She's just running at a frequency most people are too lazy to tune into. Caleb hadn't tuned in. His mother hadn't. Sloane hadn't. They'd all looked at a still woman and decided still meant nothing was moving. They'd looked at patience and called it permission. They'd been wrong, and the wrongness had cost them everything they'd reached for. Maren finished her tea. The bay was warming gold under the sun now, and somewhere out past the point a loon called once and went quiet again. She stood, and she carried her mug inside, and she rinsed it and set it in the rack, and she felt the plain, unshowy thing she'd been waiting most of her life to feel, which was not triumph and was not even peace, exactly. It was her own full height, in a room with no one in it to perform smallness for, and the simple, astonishing relief of standing all the way up in it at last.